I was a child of Vietnam. I was born in 1954. I came of age at 18 in 1972, and I was a legal adult at age 21 in 1975. 1954 is, of course, the fall of the French at Dien Bien Phu when the United States entered Vietnam. 1972 was the year of the Paris Peace Accords when the United States formally decided to exit Vietnam. 1975 was the fall of South Vietnam to the communists in the north. My life was infused with the news and stories of Vietnam. I worked alongside men who had been in Vietnam, and I had friends whose brothers had fought in Vietnam. When I became a young physician, I took care of Vietnam vets suffering from PTSD. Like many people of my generation, I can tell you many stories that I heard about Vietnam. It was a war that affected everyone, even children. I remember crying in my bedroom one night when I was 11 years old. My mother came into the room to console me. It was dark in that room, and she asked me why I was crying. And I told her, I don't want to die in Vietnam. My mother told me to put aside my worries that the Army didn't take 11-year-old boys. But I'm sure she cried that night when she left the room. When I was 12 years old, our family took a vacation to Washington, D.C. and Annapolis. We visited the statue of John Paul Jones. There was a guest book there that people could sign. Everybody in my family signed the book, but I did not. My father was confused. He asked me why I didn't want to sign the book. And I told him, hey, I just don't want to sign the book. Now that was a diversion, of course. The real reason was that I was afraid that if I signed the book, the United States government would get my name and ship me off to Vietnam. Such was the effect of the war. And we all thought it was a stupid, useless war. At least all my friends did. We discussed the Vietnam War in our fifth grade current events class in 1965. Someone brought in an article in which the author talked about how soldiers were not allowed to go into certain areas. They weren't allowed to do certain things. Now, this was commonly known as rules of engagement. Now, we 11 and 12-year-old boys laughed at that. We thought that was stupid. And I'm pretty sure the soldiers in Vietnam thought so too. What kind of war was this? I thought at the time. Even we young boys who had played cops and robbers, cowboys and Indians, and army around our neighborhood knew that there were no rules in war or conflict. How is it possible that our leaders, people like Robert McNamara, did not understand that? Now, this led to a greater question which bothered me for many decades. Were our leaders stupid or were they devious? Now, maybe you have asked that question yourself. Now, an overwhelming majority of us back in the 60s and 70s thought that Robert McNamara was a doofus, a horribly misguided doofus. But not too many people thought he was evil. Now, I'm sure now, as I look back, that there were many academics who felt that he was evil. But, they had more information than we, the public, had. This was before the internet. But as I've grown older and seen our government in action in subsequent wars, I've now come to believe that Robert McNamara was truly evil. And I define evil as putting money and profits above the welfare of our troops. McNamara must have understood that we had no chance of winning in Vietnam. Even he knew that the corruption in Vietnam existed from head to toe. We stepped into an impossible situation in Vietnam, and we made it worse. We made it worse in every possible way. Gabriel Kolko has written a book about Vietnam entitled An Anatomy of a War, in which he details what we did in Vietnam and why we were destined to lose. Now, why would our leaders think that we could win a war by bombing out the people we were trying to convert into a capitalist way of life? Why would we continue to support corrupt leaders like Diem and Thieu when we knew that they were thoroughly corrupt? How could we possibly think that defoliating the land the villagers used to grow rice would win them over to our side? In Vietnam, we bombed out villages, defoliated vast areas of land with Agent Orange, and herded the displaced people into refugee camps around Saigon. We destroyed their lives. We corrupted their children. Moreover, we bankrupted and destroyed their economy. Not only did we not give them a stake in the game, we took away what little stake they did have. Now, I'm sure you've heard of the My Lai massacre. Our leaders, in an attempt to sanitize their stupidity and incompetence in fighting this war, chose to hang William Calley out to dry, and in effect portray him as the reason for why we were failing in this fight. But My Lai was not an anomaly. One of my later co-workers at a clinic outside Fort Hood who had served in Vietnam told me years later that My Lai occurred every day of the week in Vietnam. It was inevitable that the communists would win this fight. It was inevitable that as the body counts of our soldiers went up, that the American people would protest. And they did protest in so many ways. It wasn't just Kent State, it was everywhere. I don't want to make it sound as if everybody was against the war. That wouldn't be true. There was a sizable portion of the population that was for it. And I must say that when I was young, there was a good part of me that was for it. Now, I don't know why I felt that way. Maybe it was part of my personality and being a contrarian to the growing consensus that the war shouldn't be fought. Or maybe it was my empathy for the men who did fight. You have to understand the times that we lived in. We had all been conditioned to be opposed to communism. Now, programming in the United States at that time was so pervasive that Hollywood made a comedy entitled The Russians Are Coming, The Russians Are Coming. After that movie came out, I asked my dad if he thought the Russians would invade us. He said he didn't care because he wouldn't be alive. Well, he was right about that because he died in 1967. In spite of my father's cynical attitude, there was real fear in the country about a communist takeover of the United States. And with the domino theory as accepted fact, many people supported the war. They were the silent majority that Nixon talked about in later years. So America was divided, and not just between people, but there was a division in the mind as well. There was that force which compelled us to be patriotic Americans, to support the government. And then there was the other force that pulled us the other way, to oppose wars that are fought stupidly. And ultimately, we all had to choose which way to go. Now, back in the 1960s, the Army had a slogan: in 11 weeks, you'll be a man. I remember driving with my family down the Pennsylvania Turnpike during one summer vacation. And there was a giant billboard with an Army recruitment ad atop it that said, in 11 weeks, you'll be a man. But someone had climbed up on that billboard and scratched out the words "a man" and written in the word "dead." Somebody knew what they were talking about. My sister Mary was 6 years older than I. And her boyfriend, who was also the same age, was agitated over the war. I was 15 years old, and the year was 1969. He was 21, and his college deferment was going to run out. I sat next to him on our parents' bed near where the telephone was located on a nightstand. he was calling his uncle in Maryland to see if he could get him into the National Guard. This damn war, he would say. The National Guard was a place where many American boys sought refuge. It was thought to be the best way to avoid the draft and certain deployment in Vietnam. Very few wanted to die on that rice paddy, and yet 58,000 soldiers did die. Another 300,000 were wounded. 420,000 suffered temporary PTSD, and 42,000 still suffer from PTSD. All told, about 2.5 million soldiers served in Vietnam. And it didn't work. I blame Robert McNamara for his faulty analysis and his methodology. McNamara, the mathematician, I concluded years later, had analyzed successful wars and had noticed that successful wars were positively correlated with more enemy soldiers being killed and more battles being won. Now, in my mind, he placed the two in the form of an equation like this. Successful wars prosecuted equals higher enemy deaths plus more battles won. And then he reversed the equation to conclude that if we killed more of their soldiers and won more battles, then we would win the war. Now, any good general can tell you that the world doesn't work that way. There's a lot more to winning a war than that. But that's the way, in my mind, that Robert McNamara looked at war. And that is why he looked at our own soldiers' deaths as acceptable losses. They were acceptable to him because we were killing more of their men and we were winning more battles. Okay, so who was this man, Robert McNamara? Where did he come from? It's important to talk about a man who was so reviled by the American people. Well, Robert McNamara was a whiz kid. That's what our media called him. Our media is very good at transforming compliant lackeys of the ruling class into living gods so that the rubes and suckers of America, of which there are many, will follow. A product of UC Berkeley, where he majored in economics with a minor in mathematics and philosophy, always a deadly combination. He attended Harvard University and got an MBA. A statistician and an accountant at heart, Robert McNamara rose high in the world of corporate America. Ultimately, he became the president of the Ford Motor Company. It was because of having attained this lofty position that John Kennedy tapped him to be defense secretary. I imagine JFK was impressed. So was Lyndon Johnson. Robert McNamara had disdain for common sense officers. And maybe he was right. But having disdain for people who may have been in the wrong doesn't make you right. You see, these generals wanted to use overwhelming firepower to win the war. They couldn't have known that McNamara's goal and corporate America's goal was not to win the war, but to make money for corporate America. Robert McNamara was the father of the use of modern-day metrics in our society. He was the first well-known person to allow metrics to supersede common sense in the waging of a war. When you see metrics-oriented leaders in healthcare today or in sports, you're looking at the ideological children of Robert McNamara. Alan Enthoven, who went on to develop the concept of managed competition in healthcare, was a protege of Robert McNamara. Metrics and statistics was what Robert McNamara believed in. It was his God. And in the end, his false God betrayed him. It wasn't just the concept of acceptable losses, though, that did us in. There was also the data from the HES, the Hamlet Evaluation System, a scoring system spearheaded by the CIA at the request of Robert McNamara. Now, this was a scoring system of pacification conducted by special operatives, many of whom were Americans who didn't speak Vietnamese, that was designed to determine if a specific hamlet, that's a neighborhood, was under the control of the RVN, that's the Republic of South Vietnam. or whether it was under the control of the enemy. The HES was designed to collect objective information about each hamlet, such as the presence of Viet Cong propaganda, local sabotage, or the general economic activity of the hamlet. There were 18 criteria that were used, divided into two broad categories of security and economic development. The data based on these criteria were then collected and collated by an evaluator who would then grade the village from A to E, whether it was a secure village or not. Politicians in America would use this scoring system to sell the war to American people. Oh, you see, we have 73% of the hamlets controlled. We're winning the war. We're doing an effective job. Now, the problem with many statistical surveys is that they're largely dependent upon data gathering that can be influenced by lying and the use of a magic pencil. Many villagers who were in league or sympathy with the enemy would lie to the evaluators as to their loyalties because they knew that if they identified themselves with the enemy, their village would be attacked. Now, some of the evaluators were lazy and didn't go into a village at all. They just filled out forms with their magic pencil. Other evaluators knew that if they gave poor scores to their bosses, they would be reprimanded, or their jobs might be in jeopardy, or they might lose funding. So they too pulled out their magic pencil and told their bosses what they wanted to hear. And so many of our leaders, wanting to be deluded to confirm their belief in American supremacy and the domino theory, felt that the war was being won. But the war wasn't being won. And what is shocking is that many of our leaders knew it. They knew that bombing campaigns were not going to subdue the enemy, yet they did it anyway. They knew that Vietnam was corrupt from head to toe, yet they persisted in waging this war. They knew that the HES was flawed, yet they marched on. We were destroying Vietnam and our own country as well. In 1972, I was 18 years of age. I worked at the Bucks County Health Department. And one of my supervisors was a man named James Williams, who had been a photographer in Vietnam. I asked him what Vietnam was like, and he told me it looked like the moon. He said there were craters everywhere. Now, this is in contrast to what a classmate had related to me and my friends when I was in junior high school. His brother had been in Vietnam, and so my classmate did a report on Vietnam for one of our social studies classes. He told us that Vietnam was a beautiful country. Well, I imagine it was before we got there. We Americans exploded an extraordinary amount of ordnance in Vietnam. 5 million to 7.5 million tons, twice the amount we laid down in World War II. Even today, 2026, there's unexploded ordnance in the ground that still goes off if the wrong person walks over it. About 10% of our bombs hit the ground and did not explode. All told, we killed somewhere between 1 to 2 million people in Vietnam. We destroyed their country. And for what? Only a few months ago, I noticed in the trash bin outside my pediatric office a carton of a toy that had been dumped there. And on the side of that box was printed, "Made in Vietnam." Well, it's a good thing those 58,000 men died, right? They died so that the Vietnamese could build toys for consumers in the United States. That's what the war was supposed to be about. It was to stop the dominoes from falling. That's what Dwight Eisenhower told us. He was the one who came up with the domino theory. He's the one who told us that if we didn't stop what was going on in Vietnam, that soon Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and everywhere else was going to fall under the spell of communism. And since Dwight Eisenhower was revered by the World War II generation, they believed him. It was that domino theory that got us into Vietnam, and it was that domino theory that kept us there until we got the stuffings beaten out of us psychologically. Yes, we did kill more of their men, and yes, we did win more battles, but that's not the same thing as achieving your objective. The objective should have been to create a viable capitalist economy that can ultimately act as a partner with the United States to serve as a further bulwark against communism, which is truly a bad system if there ever was one, as it has been practiced in the world thus far. So how did we do? Is Vietnam a thriving capitalist society? They make toys for the United States. What else do they do? Well, this is what Wikipedia has to say about Vietnam today. The economy of Vietnam is a developing, mixed, socialist-oriented market economy. It is the 33rd largest economy in the world by nominal gross domestic product, and the 23rd largest economy in the world by purchasing power. It is an upper middle income country with a rising cost of living, specifically in urban areas like Ho Chi Minh City, that was formerly Saigon, and Hanoi. Vietnam is a member of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and the World Trade Organization. How about that? What this hopefully illustrates is that we Americans, with all our bombs and dominoes, didn't make Vietnam into a thriving economy. The Vietnamese made themselves into a thriving economy. It wasn't our bombs and bullets that achieved a capitalist economy. It was a lack of bombs and bullets. And the other countries in the world who still live under the dominion of the United States, they're either equal to or worse off than Vietnam. And they will be worse off in 2050. And that is because the goal of the United States and the corporate pigs who have hijacked the United States is not to make things better in a foreign country, but to subjugate the people, to enslave them into a life of feudalism, where they exist to sell the United States cheap minerals and cheap agricultural products which we cannot grow at home. Stuff like bananas and mangoes. That was our corporate leaders' goal in Vietnam. And the war itself, well, that was just an extra bonus. The war made all sorts of money and fortunes for the corporate friends of Robert McNamara and Lyndon Johnson. And that's why it was a war that was never intended to be won. That's why we had rules of engagement. The rules of engagement existed so that our soldiers could not win the war, because won wars stop the gravy train. Continuous wars keep the gravy train going. Which returns us to our original question, the one I asked earlier, the one that had plagued me for decades. Are our leaders devious or dumb? They aren't dumb. Since many of them come from the Ivy League, where they supposedly recruit the best and brightest, we know that our leaders are not organically stupid. Now, they may not be able to separate the wheat from the chaff, which is not a function of intelligence, but of experience, but they aren't stupid. What they are is indoctrinated, like their spiritual leader, Robert McNamara. They were indoctrinated into a vicious cult of the best and brightest, also known as the cult of Harvard. While at Harvard and other Ivy League schools, they are introduced to and seduced by the men of power in the world. It's a club, and you aren't in it, but they are. And in this cult, you are subconsciously programmed into thinking that you are better than other people and that other people's lives don't count as much as your life. And this is why men like Robert McNamara can view a soldier's life as an acceptable loss. And that's a real term, by the way. That's not something I made up. That is why Dwight Eisenhower, West Point, can allow 800,000 German POWs to starve to death after World War II. That is why Mike Pompeo, West Point, Harvard, can ruthlessly violate Julian Assange's rights by having him sequestered away in a British dungeon. Now, mind you, when Mike Pompeo did that to Julian Assange, he also trampled on the rights of the men who were killed by those helicopter pilots who joked as they pulled the trigger. All this arrogance has brought application and ramifications for our current day conflict with Iran, as another Ivy League leader, Donald Trump, forces an unnecessary war with Iran. Now, people have incorrectly stated that Donald Trump has lost this war with Iran. Well, that all depends on how you define war and what the true objectives of the war are. For most people, it's about winning or achieving a positive goal. But for corporate America, it's a different ballgame. So far, corporate America is winning the game because a lot of ordnance and materiel is being expended in fighting this war. In short, corporate America is making a fortune off this war with Iran. Corporate America is going to make an even greater fortune in rebuilding all the structures that Iran has destroyed in the Gulf states. And these structures will be rebuilt. Corporate America will insist upon it. In that respect, this war is Vietnam all over again. Now, one final point. During the Vietnam War, in order to boost the troop numbers, Robert McNamara came up with a novel idea entitled Project 100,000. In Project 100,000, McNamara inducted and trained men with IQs of between 50 and 80 into the Army. Now, these men could not grasp the concept that in order to throw a grenade higher, you had to throw it at a higher angle because of gravity. Couldn't just throw it straight. Now, these men were mocked by the regular troops. In some cases, because these men had placed regular troops in danger, these intellectually disadvantaged men were killed by our own troops. Now, these men, who were cruelly labeled McNamara's morons, suffered 5 times the kill rate of a regular soldier. And that, my friend, makes Robert McNamara a war criminal, equal to Heinrich Himmler and Adolf Hitler, who gassed disabled people inside jerry-rigged trolley cars. But that is what you get when you place a man who is trained to think in terms of philosophy and the purity of numbers into a vicious cult of power that is beholden to corporations whose sole goal is to make money. Now, if Vietnam can stand for anything in our country, it must stand as a warning against that. Now, you would have thought that we would have learned a valuable lesson from Vietnam, but we didn't. Years later, in the early 1990s, less than 20 years after the fall of Vietnam, I was sitting in a doctor's lounge in Brownsville, Texas, and I was waiting for the operating room to be prepped in which mom was going to have a C-section to deliver her baby. Now, I was talking to the anesthesiologist in the lounge, and he was pontificating about his theory of war in America. Now, as we doctors are prone to do, because we're all prima donnas, he stood up as giving a speech to a crowd, and he said, "The days are over when America can run around the world and kick ass." Now, having experienced the trauma that Vietnam produced in our society, I looked at him and I said, "You're right. We've learned our lesson. Those days are over." Now, how wrong could we have been?